Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 3 about American federalism, and it's Lesson 13 concerning the Revolution of 1937. Now, please don't be confused. At the end of Lesson 12, I mistakenly said that this lesson would be about the case of Wickard versus Filburn. Now, it's correct that the case of Wickard versus Filburn will be covered by this lesson, but a more appropriate title for this lesson, I've decided, is The Revolution of 1937, and you'll see why. In this lesson, you'll learn about President Roosevelt's court packing plan. You'll also learn about Roosevelt's idea of a three-horse team. You'll learn about the Revolution of 1937, and about the case of Wickard versus Filburn. In the last several lessons, we've been learning about how American federalism has changed. And we've been discussing that by reviewing some major historical events that led to significant changes in the relationship between the states and the national government. We previously covered the Hamiltonian economic program and the American Civil War. And for the last couple lessons, we've been addressing the New Deal and the Great Society. We went through, in some detail, some of the major programs of the New Deal about creating jobs, helping labor unions, providing Social Security, and controlling production and prices. We also went through some of the major programs of the Great Society to end private discrimination, expand welfare, regulate public education, fund the arts and humanities, and protect the environment. As we went through these programs from the Great Society and New Deal, we asked ourselves, what enumerated power in the Constitution authorizes these vast government programs at the national level? We then looked through the list of enumerated rights and saw that none of them obviously address these things. But then pointed out to you that the Commerce Clause was used by the United States Congress and President Roosevelt as the justification for the New Deal, and then later by the United States Congress and Lyndon Johnson as the justification for them implementing the Great Society programs. The Commerce Clause reads that Congress can have power to regulate commerce among the several states. That's the part that's relevant to them implementing these many large domestic programs. But then in the previous lesson, we pointed out that that Commerce Clause was traditionally understood to address the problem of commerce moving across state lines. In other words, people trying to buy and sell things from one state to another. This is one of the reasons that the Constitutional Convention was held, because of difficulties in doing trade between states. And so they wanted to turn the power to regulate that over the national government so they could set uniform rules among the states to make doing business easier across state lines. But even though that was the original meaning, that the New Deal and Great Society programs don't fall under that original meaning. They require some sort of more expansive interpretation. And that's where we left things at the end of the previous lesson. So now the new material for this lesson begins by telling you that at least initially, when the United States Supreme Court was asked to review the programs of the New Deal, they struck them down as unconstitutional. They said, well, wait a minute. You claim that you're regulating commerce among the states as you set up, for example, Social Security, a retirement plan for older Americans. Well, how is collecting money from employers and then turning around and handing it to retirees an act of regulating trade, of buying and selling things across state lines? How is that even necessary to do in order to regulate trade moving back and forth across state lines? There doesn't seem to be any sort of connection at all. Or if there is a connection, it's very trivial. It's so indirect that it shouldn't even be counted as what the court thought. So those are the kind of decisions the court initially rendered in these cases, was they ruled these acts of Congress to be unconstitutional. Now, they hadn't actually ruled on Social Security. That was just an easy example for me to use for you. But on several other programs that we haven't talked about, that were among the earliest programs of the New Deal, the Supreme Court did strike them down using that same sort of reasoning. In response to the Supreme Court striking down his New Deal legislation, President Franklin Roosevelt suggested what became known as his court packing plan. He made a public announcement that he was going to try to get Congress to change the rules for how people are placed upon the Supreme Court. And he would ask them to change the rules so that he could appoint a new justice for every justice over the age of 70. Now, what that would have meant was, if his plan had been passed, he would have instantly appointed 5 new justices to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court typically, as it's been constituted in more modern times in the United States of America, is made up of 9 people. And so if the president instantly got to appoint 5 new people to the court, he would obviously pick people who agreed with him that his New Deal legislation was legitimate, and they would instantly create a majority on the court to pass all his New Deal legislation. So that's really what it was about. That's why he wanted to pack the court, so that he could bring the Supreme Court in line with his views, get them to declare his legislation constitutional, so that he and the United States Congress, which was full of Democrats as he was, could get these programs through, which they thought were really important to help people during the depths of the Great Depression. As he tried to convince people to support his idea for packing the court, he used an analogy. President Roosevelt likened the United States government to what he called a 3-horse team. So think of 3 horses trying to pull something such as a wagon or a plow. And the way the president imagined it was that 2 of the horses, the Congress and the president, were pulling together, trying to move the plow in the same direction, while the 3rd horse, the United States Supreme Court, was going off in a different direction, and thus preventing the plow from moving forward, as he claimed the American people wanted it to go. Now think about that image that he has, of him wanting the 3 branches of the government to pull together into the same direction. Now compare President Roosevelt's idea that the 3 branches of government should pull in unison in the same direction with James Madison's idea for checks and balances, that ambition should be made to counteract ambition. In other words, that the 3 branches of government should end up fighting with each other, and by fighting with each other, keep each other in check. Remember, this was a major way that James Madison wanted to be sure that the powers of the national government would remain within their bounds. We illustrated this previously in the course with this diagram, where the small gray circle represented the powers granted to the national government. So we divided among the 3 branches, and the 3 branches are fighting with each other. And Madison proposed this as a way to keep the national government within its assigned boundaries. We also previously in the course, though, discussed the anonymous anti-federalist Brutus critique of that suggestion by James Madison. Please recall that Brutus argued that the 3 branches of government would learn to cooperate, to expand their power outward, and in doing so, that they would end up gobbling up powers that belong to the states. Well, if you think about which this is more like, whether it's like Madison or like Brutus, Roosevelt's idea of how the court should operate, his 3 horses pull in unison, is clearly him favoring the thing that Brutus feared, clearly him favoring the thing that Madison denied would actually happen. He actually wants cooperation among the 3 branches of government. Now, he believes this is necessary to fight the Great Depression, to do good for the people, to put them back to work. And that may be the case, that it in fact does those things, that the national government is doing good work for the people in getting this power. But it's also clearly an example of the national government grabbing power for itself, and in so doing, taking power away from the states, changing the balance of American federalism. So, whether it was a good idea or not, it's clearly an idea that transformed the nature of constitutional government in America. Well, after Roosevelt threatened to appoint new justices to the Supreme Court, what happened was one of the justices actually started changing his mind about the New Deal cases. One of the justices who had voted against the legislation, who had helped declare it unconstitutional, suddenly began siding with Roosevelt and declaring all his acts to be valid. Now, since the Supreme Court had 9 justices, and the previous New Deal legislation had been struck down by a vote of 5-4, having this one justice switch sides meant that now Roosevelt's New Deal legislation was winning by a vote of 5-4. And that dramatic change of the Supreme Court flip-flopping because of this one changed vote, from striking down New Deal legislation as going beyond the powers of the national government to suddenly upholding all the New Deal legislation, has become known as the switch in time that saved 9. Now, that's a play on an old saying. There's an old saying that a stitch in time saves 9. In other words, if you have a tear that begins in a fabric, and while the tear is really small, you put in a single stitch to stop the tear, then the tear won't get bigger. And that way it saves you from having to make 9 stitches later on. Well, someone cleverly changed that to, rather than a stitch in time saving 9, instead of a switch in time save 9. And what they're suggesting is Justice Owen Roberts switching his vote to the other side saved the Supreme Court from getting packed by Roosevelt's legislation. Once the Supreme Court had switched sides, there was no reason to go forward with the court packing plan, and in fact, it did not end up being voted in favor by the United States Congress. So the court packing plan failed. In a sense, Roosevelt lost the battle, but he won the war. The Supreme Court switched and became a backer of his programs rather than an opponent to them. This change by the court became known afterwards as the Revolution of 1937, because before this they were striking down New Deal legislation as being supported by an illegitimate interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Now afterwards, they are endorsing the interpretation of the Commerce Clause offered by Roosevelt and the Congress. They're accepting it as a legitimate way to justify these new powers of the United States Congress. And that dramatically changed the powers of the national government. That's why it was called revolutionary. So I'll give you one particular example of just how extreme this stretches the powers of the national government. The New Deal included among its programs control of production and prices. And a particular example of that was the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, which set production quotas for various farm products, including wheat. Well, there was a farmer in Nebraska named Roscoe Filburn who ended up raising a little bit more wheat than he was supposed to under the program, and he got caught, and he got a fine from the national government. Well, he opposed that fine, and his case eventually went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. When the case came before the Supreme Court, the question they had to answer was whether it's necessary and proper for Congress to limit wheat production, such as what Mr. Filburn was having on his farm in excess of the quotas, even if that extra production is merely for home use. See, Roscoe Filburn raised a little bit more wheat than he was supposed to according to his quota, but the extra wheat that he was raising beyond what the government had told him to told him he could raise, he was keeping entirely on his farm for his own home use, such as for grinding up to bake bread for his family. So it was not wheat that was going into the marketplace to be sold to anybody else. It was not being moved over state lines. So Roscoe Filburn argued that it's simply not commerce in any way, shape, or form. Commerce involves trading things, and the Commerce Clause specifically says Congress can regulate trade that's going across state lines, in other words, among the states. So he said, as long as this wheat is just sitting on my farm and I'm not selling it to anyone, it can't possibly fall under Congress's power to regulate commerce among the states. So the Supreme Court had to decide whether regulating his use of wheat to grind up and bake bread for his family was something that Congress had to regulate, was necessary for them to regulate, in order to regulate commerce among the states. In rendering their decision in the case, the Supreme Court decided that even local activities, in other words, things that are not going to move across state lines, even local activities that can't be regarded as commerce, in other words, buying and selling things, such as him keeping the wheat just on his own farm to grind up and bake his own bread, can still be regulated by Congress if they have a substantial effect on commerce, even if that effect is indirect. Well, what do they mean by a substantial effect? Well, in this case, they said, even if his wheat is never intended to be marketed, the fact that he grows it at home and then uses it himself means that that wheat kept at home is competing with wheat that actually is being sold on the market. Now, what they mean by that is, if he keeps the wheat on his farm and grinds it up to bake his own bread, then he's not going to go buy wheat from somebody else to make his bread, or he's not going to go buy bread from somebody else since he's making it at home. So in that sense, it's competing with wheat that actually is being sold in commerce, potentially between states. And they said that even if Roscoe Filburn's contribution to this act of competing with commerce is very small, even if by the fact him keeping the wheat on his farm means that only a few less loaves of bread in the entire country are sold every year. They say if you take that with other people similarly situated, in other words, if other farmers did the same thing, and you added up all of them keeping wheat on their farms to bake their own bread, then they say it would not be a trivial effect. It would be a big enough effect that Congress could regulate it. Now think about that moment, what they're saying. A non-economic act, a purely local act, if it can potentially have a big effect on commerce. If a whole bunch of people do it and you add up them all doing it together, then Congress can regulate that thing. Well, a critic of these line of decisions makes a very important insight that I'm going to show you on the next slide. But for right now, let's make sure that you understand the rule coming out of this case and how expansive it is. Local non-commercial acts, taken in aggregate. In other words, if you add them all up together, or even the potential of them all adding up together, if they would then have a substantial effect on commerce, even if it's indirect, Wickard versus Filburn says Congress can regulate it. Well, a critic of this line of decisions, not here, this quote isn't from the Wickard case, but from a similar case the year before, said, if you take this view of the Commerce Clause, then almost anything, marriage, birth, death, can in some fashion affect commerce. In the next lesson, we're going to see if that's really true. All right, let's review what we learned in this lesson. First of all, what was Roosevelt's court packing plan? Was it to limit the court's authority, reduce the court's size, add new justices to the court, or add new cases to the court? He wanted to add new justices to the court. How did Roosevelt want the three branches of government to behave? Do you want them to compete for power, check and balance each other, cooperate together, or ignore each other? Roosevelt wanted the branches to do what Brutus had feared. He wanted them to actually cooperate with each other. So what then was the revolution of 1937? Did it expand national powers? Did it involve a presidential assassination? Did a new political party win power? Or was it a set of constitutional amendments? The Revolution of 1930 expanded national powers through the Supreme Court endorsing new laws passed by Congress in new areas. And what was so important about Wickard versus Filburn? Was it important because it limited Congress's power? Because it upheld vast congressional powers? Because it ended New Deal legislation? Or because the Supreme Court changed its mind in this case? It's important because it upheld vast congressional power. Remember, the basic idea from Wickard is if you take a whole bunch of local activities that aren't acts of commerce, and if you add them all up together and you can imagine them having an effect on commerce, then Congress can regulate it. All right, that does it for this lesson about the Revolution in 1937. Next lesson will be from Unit 3, Lesson 14, and it's about the national police power.